So on that note, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. We've got two interesting guest speakers here, both from New and American Promise, Ellen LaPolice, who's a state manager, and John McCrea, who is the head of the National Business,
Network.
Network. That's network. And we're excited because John lives in Reston, Virginia. So anyway, I just wanted to start with a brief overview just on who we are, what we're doing in Virginia. And then my colleague Mike Horton will introduce the two speakers and we'll go from there. So anyway, I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. This is a part of which I showed last night in Loudoun County, and I noticed that Chris is here. I think he attended that session too. So we're just going to do a brief review of money and politics, what's happened to Virginia and nationally. And so I'm the coordinator for American Promise. We have a bunch of our members on who are attending this. What is American Promise? It's sort of a funny name, but it's a cross-partisan nonprofit organization to empower citizens advocacy in all 50 states to pass a constitutional amendment. Basically a constitutional amendment to allow Congress and the states to regulate election spending. And we would be remiss in our great pay-to-play Commonwealth if we didn't also focus on campaign finance and ethics reform. Why do we think that? I think everybody knows that we the people, not money, super PACs or corporations govern. And this is, I think that everybody out there can identify the entry point that brings them to the issue. Whether it's Dominion, energy, everybody hates Dominion, broader issues of climate change, clean car energy, bills that were defeated in the Virginia Senate last year, spiraling drug prices, dysfunctional healthcare system, nursing care home regulations, broadband access that really came up during COVID, and we recognize the power of the networks in terms of limiting municipal broadband authorities in Virginia. I came in as an entry point as an economist for the United Nations poverty programs, the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit that can lower child poverty by 50%, getting those funded, that's affected by money. And I think that our speakers tonight will bring a lot of different issues, and especially Alan LaPolice from Kansas, agriculture. I'm an agricultural economist looking at the importance of, looking at the Farm Bill, agricultural subsidies, corporate farming, and also looking at the defense, industrial defense system and contractors in the military. But I think that everybody just recognizes it's one thing to sort of see it in the newspaper, but when you look at it on a graph, it's like, holy cow, that was really a blowout. $14 billion. And it's interesting because a lot of that was independent spending. Obviously, this goes back to, I'm not going through all the the Supreme Court rulings that have led to this. Certainly Citizens United was the big one. And interestingly enough, Citizens United was a Virginia company. So all roads lead for money in politics, lead through Virginia, including back to Lewis Powell when in 1972 in Richmond, when he wrote the Powell memo. And that was followed, and this will come up when I'm looking at some of the money that's coming into the Virginia thing on the issue of Buckley versus Vallejo, which actually was the bill that allowed election spending. That is why you cannot curtail spending from independently financed candidates, such as Bloomberg and such. We'll look at that, a couple of people in Virginia, cost of Virginia elections. If you shifted that access, I think you'd probably see that it follows a similar trend. Of course, Virginia has a lot of issues, in terms of policy, one of only 5 states with no limits on campaign finance. All campaign finance bills in the last General Assembly and the year before, and we testified, all died in committee, except for one that, the Bulova committee. They're doing a committee to study campaign finance that we're trying to influence. So those, one of the things that we're working on is trying to get common sense campaign finance rules and legislation passed in Virginia. Certainly you look at District 40, in 2019, they spent $40 million for an election for a delegate post that pays less than $18,000 a year. Now that's a sort of crazy story. I took this from VPAP, the Virginia Public Access Project, and I think it raises a couple issues. This shows the two sides of the campaign finance coin, the federal issues versus the state issues. And obviously you can see Youngkin, who's a Republican candidate for governor, and just gave himself a $12 million loan. There was Pete Schneider, who was also in the race, a Republican. Even Mark Levine, my delegate, you know, he lost for lieutenant governor, but he gave himself almost $1 million loan. Couple points of interest. $2.3 million from Dominion, whom everybody hates. But in fact, you look at Dominion and they actually gave more to the Democrats this year, 1.6 than to the Republicans, which makes a challenge in terms of how to target and how to get legislation passed. And then you look at Clean Virginia. Michael Bill's the owner of Clean Virginia, 4 million. Clean Virginia Fund, 3.3, and Sonia Smith, who is his wife. So they've almost put in $10 million. What does this say? Self-financing allowed by the Supreme Court ruling. We need to have that constitutional amendment. Dark money is coming into our elections. At the bottom of the slide, the independent spending, where you had almost $1 million of undisclosed ads coming in attacking Republicans before the primary. Both parties are complicit, you know, in taking money, whether it's Dominion or not, and more money injected into election is a race to the bottom. And that's why Virginia rates 46 on the Swamp Index. That Swamp Index is Coalition for Integrity. You know, here we are in Virginia. We're only followed by Utah, Michigan, Arizona, Idaho, and Wyoming. So it's pretty embarrassing. But so what is our group? Legislative outreach. We're doing a lot of trying to get pledges. Why are Beyer and Conley here? Well, because they signed the pledge and they also signed HR 1, which I think that probably Alan will talk about. It's in the House right now. We're trying to get all 7 Democratic legislators to sign it like they did in the last session, and then plan on how to engage with Republicans, because in order to have this constitutional amendment, it has to be bipartisan. Input into the Bulova study. What are the best practices around the state, the country, building awareness, engaging with journalists, building partnerships, talking to the Loudoun County Democrats yesterday, and building our group across the state. And I think at this point, I'm just going to reach out, stop sharing my screen, because I think what we need to deal with, you know, and hopefully John and Alan will help us, is how to build our group, how to build partnerships, how to build messages. So I'm going to turn over the proverbial screen to my colleague, Mike, and he's going to introduce our speakers.
So Nancy, before we do that, could you do 30 seconds, not more than 30 seconds, on what the Bulova study is? Because I think that's really important.
Yeah, the Bulova study, as I mentioned, there were probably 10 bills in the General Assembly, and they all died except for the Bulova study, which is a study looking at campaign finance and specifically what are best practices across the country. And we testified, and our hope is this will lead to legislation, ready legislation that can be introduced in the General Assembly, whether it's on caps, general limitation, disclosure, or monitoring and evaluation. So that's a committee, that's the only play in town. And so that's what we hope to influence.
Okay, thank you. So we have 2 speakers for today. Alan LaPolice, who is American Promise's new state manager, which is, if I understand correctly, is basically a state coordinator to coordinate and integrate the different state chapters of American Promise. Alan is from a long line of farmers in Kansas, a lifelong educator who has traveled and lived around the globe and returned to Kansas and run for Congress 3 times, once as a Republican, once as an independent, and once as a Democrat, which I can't wait to hear about. And each time did this without really changing his message, which it says a lot about, I think, where we are. And now Alan is working with American Promise in an effort to just basically recapture our democracy. And then the other speaker we have is John McCrea, who is American Promise's business network manager. And John has spent 30 years implementing enterprise IT services projects, which is basically applying information technology to different areas of an organization to try and increase their effectiveness, which I think is right in line with where we are as a state organization right now. John has led 3 successful startups and now committed to working through American Promise to successfully engage the business in an effort
in the tree.
to not leveling the political field, as we've discovered we should not say, but to preventing corruption and its appearances. So we're hoping that today they will help provide us with a national perspective on initiatives to get money out of politics and help us learn what practices have worked best among the different states to hopefully get our message out and be more effective and hopefully work on passing campaign finance legislation in the next General Assembly. So I don't know who's going to go first, but there you go.
I will gladly go. And I first need to apologize. Just moments before this this event began, someone cut the wrong wire here in Manhattan, Kansas, and ended all broadband communication other than my cell phone. So joining you, I would have been delighted to share screens and present all kinds of slides and PowerPoint things, but I will briefly say why I've done what I've done. I grew up in Kansas. I'm a 5th generation Kansas farmer. You know, farming was my life growing up. I didn't intend to be a farmer for all my life, but I saw how the agriculture community required federal support, federal subsidies, federal, we require international trade because American farmers produce twice as much as we consume. And so we've got to have good trade deals. I became very good friends with Professor Barry Flinchbaugh. He was the greatest ag economist, and he wrote every farm bill since basically the 50s. I got involved in politics because the representative that we had here in the 1st District of Kansas was terrible. He had gotten himself kicked off of the ag committee, so he couldn't represent. He couldn't include anything or advocate for the farm bill. He was an original Tea Partier. He was nothing but obstruction. There was no spending bill he would ever vote yes on. He didn't represent what I believed Kansas historically represented. I grew up, not far from Dwight D. Eisenhower's boyhood home in Abilene. I'm 20 minutes from there right now. I looked to find someone to challenge him in the Republican primary because that's the only game in the 1st District of Kansas, and no one would do it. So ultimately, I decided to do it, and because I believed in nonpartisanship, I didn't feel anything wrong with running in the Republican primary, especially as an Eisenhower Republican. And to my friends, I would jokingly say today an Eisenhower Republican is slightly to the left of Bernie Sanders when you look at the tax code and his investment in domestic infrastructure, education, science, and technology. I very nearly won that race, but the thing that stopped me from winning the congressional seat was that I found alliances up on Capitol Hill in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in the Republican Main Street Coalition, and with the Speaker of the House, John Boehner. Unfortunately, in each of those situations, they required a commitment. They required an actual loyalty pledge. And that was simply too much for me to do because I would explain to them, I don't have loyalty to the Republican Party. I have loyalty to the American people and the citizens of my district. Well, that didn't push me over the finish line, but I got very close. In the next election cycle, I decided to run it the way I truly wanted to, which was as an independent candidate. Found out that both parties were opposed to that, and neither party would give me any shelter. And then the 3rd time I ran it, believing that I had set the path towards bipartisanship, and if I was going to actually walk the walk, then I needed to bridge that divide entirely. I was asked by 2 former Democratic governors in the state of Kansas, because historically we've voted just as many Democrats as we have Republicans. And I ran a race as a Democrat. I still did better than any Democrat in the history of this district. I did it without selling out to either of the parties. I still couldn't close the deal on it because each party, they would require their pound of flesh, which I wasn't willing to give. So another part of my history is that I've been a lifelong educator for 15 years. After that third campaign, I worked for the VA for a while, but I was always advocating for the 28th Amendment because having been inside, I realized that the only path to get anything done, no matter what you personally advocate for, no matter what you personally believe in, as far as legislative policy in the United States, if we cannot get the corrosive influence of money out of the races, out of the system, then nothing else will ever get done. If you believe in agricultural support, it won't happen until you get rid of the money. If you believe in the environment, if you believe in education, infrastructure, anything that you might advocate for, even if it's just the Second Amendment, it won't happen. And I don't need to explain to this group, you know the problem, but let me impart that it is such a problem that you can't even get really good candidates on either side, because the only candidate that will get the full backing and financial support is the one willing to pledge loyalty. So in doing that, I got to meet, the insiders, and I found out very clearly that there's a game that you got to play. There's a language that you have to use. So in my role as American Promise state manager, my job is to get all of the states ready to ratify. It's to work with all of the chapters, all of the American Promise chapters across the United States, in supporting them, in working with local, state, and even federal legislators, prepare them to get the amendment across the floor of the Congress, get it passed, and then ratified in 3/4 of the states. The only way that we can do that is that we have to employ a right to left structure, a right to left campaign. As you know, any Democrat in the US House or in the Congress or in the Senate that you talk to, they're more than likely all in favor of HJR1. They're more than likely going to advocate for, overturning Citizens United and regulating campaign finance. But without strong bipartisan support, it will never happen. So my job really is to convince enough Republican legislators and enough Republican leaning states that it's in their own best economic and legislative interest to overturn Citizens United and pass this amendment. The way that you do that is you have to approach them in a federalist sort of way. I've found in the meetings I've had with the Republicans on the Hill that if you frame this in a 10th Amendment sort of a framework, if you explain that the states should be able to regulate and to secure their own elections, and with this exponential growth in outside spending, you don't have that. The Congress should be able to regulate federal elections, but because of Citizens United, you don't have that. So if you really push the notion that the 10th Amendment says those powers not designated within the Constitution belong to the states or to the people, then you can get a lot of Republican allies in this. They may still want to toe the line that, well, isn't money protected speech? Isn't it protected by the First Amendment? And then you have to ask them, do you really believe that? Do you really believe that overwhelming spending by dark moneyed interests who aren't even willing to identify themselves, if that is free speech, then where does that take us? When talking to Republican legislators, both state and federal, you can point out that in the 2020 election, the Democrats outspent the Republicans by a large margin. The Republicans were hit with 2-to-1 spending from outside dark money groups, and Republican members of Congress were attacked. They were hit with dark money attack ads at a ratio of 5-to-1. So you go back 6, 8, 10 years, and sure, the Republicans sort of had this as this was their baby. They could always rely on the Chamber of Commerce giving them plenty of money that they can use to win their election. But this last election cycle, the tables turned, and the Democrats they far outspent them. And there's no reason to believe that they won't be able to outspend them in the next election cycle and the one after that. So so that we can be successful, we really do have to employ this right to left strategy. We have to get Republican legislators on board. My job right now, I'm working with 24 Republican members of Congress who are interested in collaborating on an amendment with language that they like. And one of the big sells that I've been able to get them on board with is to couple this with term limits. They feel that that might be a winning strategy. Am I still on? Because I'm curious.
Yes.
I-
you're up.
You just
Okay.
there for a second.
In area.
All right. Yeah, I was droning on for quite a while without checking in. So we have American Promise has a lot of. They're not what we would call champions on the Hill, but we had very good, very fruitful conversations with Congressman Gallagher. We already have Congressman Katko. He's sponsoring the legislation. We have, I believe we've got people like Adam Kinzinger who believes in America first. I mean, back to my point, any Democrat on the Hill that you talk to, and we can get them on board, and we can alter the language, and they'll still be allies. But if we don't get, a good number of Republican legislators, then we're not going to get this through. And if we can't get a good number of red states willing to ratify, then we won't have an amendment. So I guess I want to bring it up for questions, but that's kind of the strategy. Get as many Republicans on board with an argument about federalism, the 10th Amendment. It's in your best interest. I've spoken with a lot of Republicans who were outspent, even in their primaries. Even you can point out, did you have a primary challenger? And did that primary challenger find more dark money than you did? They'll all acknowledge that they're expected to spend 50 to 70% of their time raising money just to be competitive. But even the money they raise doesn't make a difference when these outside spending groups they don't even have to ask them to spend. They'll just spend based on, a radical ideology. And if they don't change that, then the election process itself will be even more so out of their hands in future races.
Alan, Mike has a question about term limits. And in fact, it came up like in Michigan. I know Mike, our AP colleague has said in Michigan, it shows, term limits actually lead to increased money in politics. And I think there was just an article about Missouri. So Mike, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so I'm curious about the term limits focus. One, I absolutely support and agree with the approach of right to left. I absolutely, we have to be nonpartisan in this. And I think you're right that, suddenly all this dark money is coming in from the Democratic side. That is our opportunity to try and convince the people that would normally be very skeptical about this that, yeah, we need to do something about this, and for the right reasons. But the term limits issue, I'm really curious about, because I lived in California throughout the 90s, pretty much the whole decade of the 90s, when they implemented a term limits rule. And after about 3 cycles, election cycles, what we discovered was the term limits moved all of the power out of the parties and into the lobbyists, because the lobbyists were the only ones that were there long enough to have institutional memory. And they were the ones that suddenly could push the agenda. And I was a big term limits supporter at the time, and I've now come 180, where I agree with the concept of term limits, but the outcome just has not been what I thought it would be. So I was hoping you could speak to that.
No, it's an excellent point, and it's the best argument against term limits, because it's true. The lobbyists are retained indefinitely, and another big factor that people up on the Hill argue is that if you implement term limits, then the staffers will be in charge of everything, because the staffers, they stay, they have continuity, they just move around, they're there. And I would argue 2 things. One, knowing how the Hill operates, the staffers do everything now anyway. You don't find members of Congress that attend any of the hearings. They only go when C-SPAN's got a camera on them for their speeches. And 2, the lobbyists run everything right now too. The lobbyists own the process. Now, let me share my personal opinion. When this goes to the vote and when we actually go for our amendment language, I'm a purist. I want it to be strictly about campaign finance. I want it to overturn Citizens United. I would like it to say that money is not protected by the First Amendment in any capacity. And I want that put in the Constitution. And I want to differentiate between legal entities, artificial created entities, such as unions and corporations, and natural born persons. That's the language that I want. We've got Republicans on the Hill who are asking, wait, we think this is our grand bargain. Let's couple language. And so we've got one like Jack Bergman is asking us for language. We provided it. He may be just using us to get his term limits language. And then our AP language is sort of an afterthought. Personally, between you and me, that's what I'm doing too. I mean, I would love to leave behind or create a separate bill for the term limits. And I won't be fighting nearly as hard for that because I agree. I think that there are some members of Congress who deserve to be there. They should be there because they have the ability to pass legislation. There are fewer and fewer of them. But when it comes down to passage of this amendment, I would hope that we have a way of getting enough support and then separating out the two pieces to create the 28th Amendment, which is simply overturning Citizens United. And then if we proceed with something else, it would involve term limits. Bergman's language right now, I think it gives members of Congress, he wants to change it to 4-year terms instead of 2-year terms. House members, he wants to give them 4 to 5 terms, which is still 20 years, and senators 3 to 4 terms, which is 18 to 24. So the language that they want is it's not 6 years in the House, 6 years in the Senate, and that's it. And like I said, truly what I want, what I would advocate for is to bring them on board together and then separate out the two pieces of legislation and see how we do on the vote.
So Alan, as a follow-up, I believe that if you tie term limits to this completely, you will lose some of the Democrats that have been there long enough and just won't go with that because they don't want to leave. And we're seeing that in Virginia, where some of the Republicans are actually very sympathetic to our position because they're new and all of a sudden they've won and they're charged with trying to raise all this money before they can do anything else. However, some of the Democrats who have been in place for a long time are actually against this because they already have their financing all laid out. And I think you'll end up with the same thing with the term limits. So I would really encourage the idea of tying them or associating them together, but not tying them together as we move forward so that it's, a loose association.
No, I would agree. I think that's probably a good way to proceed. When they requested the language, they asked it to be part of the same lengthy resolution. Ultimately, I hope that's not the path that we take. It won't be mine to decide, but I agree. I would like to keep them separate from the beginning. There's also, there's other ways. There's always legal ways of dodging it, such as a grandfather clause. Anybody currently in Congress isn't affected by this. It starts now. So someone who's been up on the Hill for 20, 30, 40 years, we could put language that says commencing on 2024, then there's always a way to word it to keep them involved. I'm hopeful that we can separate the two, but for now, any approach that doesn't give up too much of what American Promise believes in, which is just the Citizens United piece, any approach that gets us closer to 2/3 in Congress, we'll navigate those waters as best we can. Is that fair?
Agreed. Agreed.
Yeah,
Okay.
and John DeVore has a question. John?
Yes, please.
I wanted to just mention that in New Jersey, we met during the lobby day with the Deputy Chief of Staff of Jeff Van Drew, who is currently a Republican, but was supportive as a Democrat of the resolution in the state. And I think I forget if he was a co-sponsor or not. Bottom line is Marie Henselder Kimmel, who's one of the leaders here, had a letter to the editor published just in the last day or so, praising his leadership in supporting getting dark money out of politics. That's in preparation for a follow-up meeting in district, hopefully with him. And so I just kind of wanted to mention that and say that other parts of this strategy with respect to Jeff Van Drew in New Jersey are going to be related to John McCrea's function also, which is we want to look and do some educational events down there with business groups and or groups that Jeff Van Drew is personally associated with. So I just kind of wanted to mention that and at some point touch base with you and John as well on working strategy on that, because my part's going to be because of my background and experience looking for some opportunities to have events in his
Well,
district.
Joan, thanks for that transition. Mike, you want to make the introduction to John McCrea, since Joan brought up the business aspects of.
I absolutely can. However, I did it earlier, so I I laid out who John is and everything. So
that was a nice introduction. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
So in terms of engagement with the business community, a little history at American Promise. Two people, Jack and Elizabeth Doty, a father and daughter combination, were the first two, I believe about 5 years ago, who brought up the idea with Jeff Clements, who is our president, to have an engagement to the business community. And Jeff supported that idea many years ago, and Elizabeth is still associated with American Promise. She's more part-time now and gone on to work at the University of Michigan as the director of corporate political responsibility, and I'll talk a little bit more about Elizabeth in a second. But anyway, I am the first full-time head of the business network, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about three different things. One would be our engagement and outreach to the business community, basically the philosophy behind our approach, and then the day-to-day tactics of implementing that approach. So I'm going to talk largely about that. And then the second thing will be directing you all to our National Business Network Library, which is on our website and has a lot of really good stuff in there that Elizabeth and Jack. Elizabeth is a Harvard MBA. She's very, very smart. And we have a lot of really good collateral in there for connecting with the business community. And then lastly, a three-step process for very simple for how we're going to build a business network nationally. So those are the three areas I'd like to talk to you about. So back to the first one, which is our engagement and business outreach. Small businesses are really the lifeblood in terms of employment in this country. Depending on the state, they can employ from 50 to 70% of the workforce, which is staggeringly large number, right? You know, in Virginia, we might think of, you know, Dominion, or we may think of Google or Amazon or some of these huge names, General Dynamics. And yes, they're large employers, and yes, they're very important. But if you look at the sheer number, excuse me, 1 second.
So John, you were sharing your screen for a moment, but you're not now. I'm not sure if you're intending to.
I didn't mean to, but I will in a second. Getting to that point in 1 second. Yeah, so in Virginia, I think the number is not as high as 70%. I think we're in the lower or mid 50% range. So our outreach is really concentrated on the small and mid-sized businesses. Now, that's not to say we're not interested in the large businesses, but it's a very long cycle with them because they have fleets of attorneys and they have fleets of governance people that has to get approval. And we do have some wins there that I want to talk to you about, but in general, we want to spend a lot of our time on small and mid-sized businesses, not the large businesses. But to just give you 2 points of reference in terms of large businesses, can you see Maureen Klein's picture here?
Yeah.
Okay, so she's a recent statement of business principle signer, and you can see that she signed at the bottom there in blue as the VP of Public Affairs at Pirelli Tire. So she is not only signing for herself, she is signing for the entire organization, which is hard to do for these big companies because, like I said, they have fleets of attorneys and approvals and governance. But in the case of Pirelli, they're headquartered in Georgia with offices in New York City in terms of their American presence. We were very fortunate to have her sign. Now, some people have said to me, you know, a really good place for you to spend your time would be to work with the ESG rating groups. So ESG is the environmental, societal, and governance. It's basically, I guess, a recently new investment, basically credential, and billions of dollars are flowing into that recently. And some people, such as Elizabeth Doty now, who's at Michigan, she's trying to work with the rating agencies. I think there's 3 of them internationally. And what she's trying to do is see if basically the wording of the 28th Amendment could be included in part of the G for governance. So the environmental, societal, and governance. So that's like a whole nother effort, and it's you know, very, very complex, and I think we'll leave that to people like Elizabeth. But if that were to happen, you know, that would be a force multiplier for us. So it would be very exciting, you know, if that were to happen down the road. So also another large company that's been for actually since their inception really against money in politics, and they've categorically refused to donate from day one of their existence is IBM. And they're here locally, obviously, big presence here locally. But they're not going to sign the pledge because they feel like they've done enough, and they don't want to be necessarily associated with a reform organization such as ourselves. But they, you know, publicly blog about it all the time, which is great. So those are, you know, 2 corporations that are obviously very large, and we're very happy to have on board. But that's kind of a distraction because really we need to focus on the small and mid-sized businesses. Let me share this. We have a campaign going now in Maine that was very successful. We released a report called Under the Avalanche, which was about the $200 million spent in the Maine election recently. And my friends in Maine told me that we took over the media in that state for about 10 days. People from Maine do not like to be told what to do by outside money. So this is an example of a small business owner, Pete DeFore, who signed our pledge. And what I'm trying to do is have him amplify his voice and the number of people that have supported us in Maine by coming up with my communications department, you know, very cool graphic that he's going to post in his LinkedIn group. And below this, it's going to have the connection, the hot link with our petition. But somebody like Pete, he has 13 employees, 10 of which are CPAs. He does the tax returns for about 1,500 small businesses in Maine, small being from, 500,000 revenue. I think he said he has one or two that are up to 30 million in revenue. But he also has about 1,500 individual people that he does the tax returns for. He has over 3,000 connections in LinkedIn. So this is the type of outreach we're trying to do to amplify their voices through LinkedIn, right? Because in many ways, my job is much easier than our communication director, who has to deal with Facebook and Snapchat and all the other social media platforms. In business, it's pretty much all LinkedIn. So that makes it easy for me. So that's an example of the outreach we're doing in Maine. And I think in Virginia, we'd want to follow a similar path, where we're focusing on the small and mid-sized businesses, because usually it's maybe a guy and his wife owning a business. The approval is 2 people. It's not fleets of attorneys and that kind of thing. So I think that should probably be our approach in Virginia as well. The small and mid-sized businesses are our bread and butter. And then Nancy, you were asking me about, and obviously Alan talked really well about our approach going from right to left in terms of issues to potentially attract business people to our cause. The two that I can think of that I think the one I can think of that all businesses will agree with, whether they're owned by Republicans or Democrats, or whether they're a small business, mid-sized business, or a large business, is the price of medical, and the fact that in general people are not happy with their medical plans. I ran 3 small businesses, and in the course of my career, medical expenses went up from about 10% of a person's salary to over 30%. So you can imagine the hit that takes to the bottom line of every company, whether it's owned by a Republican or a Democrat, whether it's a Republican talking point like negotiating prescription prices, or a Democratic talking point about universal health care. The point is we can't have stagnation anymore in terms of medical. I think as a country, we're spending twice as much as the nearest developed country, and people are not twice as happy with our medical. So that's kind of a safe issue, I think, to always bring up, because every business owner will agree that the costs are out of control, and what we can do about it. Another possible point is immigration, but that can be controversial. I ran a IT services company. There was a shortage of high-end IT skills. There's still a shortage, so I had to process a lot of H-1s and green cards, mainly at the time people from India. India was a machine in terms of cranking out computer science majors, a lot of them with master's degrees. And one thing that hindered my growth was the lack of consistent immigration. And I was interested in highly skilled IT workers, but immigration is another issue also for some lower skilled businesses as well. That issue may be more controversial. So perhaps, the medical is a good place to begin the discussions. Let me see here. I've been talking for a long time. Is there any questions, or
Yeah, I have a quick question, and I'm just going to share my screen because I'm not sure how many people in Virginia have signed it's not a pledge, it's a statement of principle or something. But here's a colleague in Alexandria, and she's the owner of a small business architectural firm. Big money in politics is crippling innovation in building technology. And it's basically, this is an anti-dominion thing because our energy policies in Virginia are basically controlled by Dominion. And even Costco and Walmart there was a big discussion because they wanted to get more renewables. And so that might be an entry point for Virginia. But the question on the red to the blue, and this, perhaps I'm jumping the gun in terms of Mike's, our moderated question, because most of us are from Northern Virginia. We're basically blue. Even though on campaign finance on a state legislation, we were worried about senior Democrats not supporting state campaign finance. But to get businesses, their voices, we need to go into other districts. And so the question is, what are the messages and what is the engagement? And this is both for Alan and for John. We have 11 representatives, 7 of whom are Democrat, 4 of whom are Republican. We would love to engage with the Republicans. They're mainly very conservative Republicans and, moving further and further to the left. The question is, a couple of our members, Denny he's in the business community in Alexandria. Alexandria is Democrat, but another colleague is in Whitman's district, which is red. So the question is how to engage and how to do messaging in Virginia and engaging in more conservative areas.
Alan, do you want to take a stab at that in general, or?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. If I were sitting with Whitman or somebody else in the state legislature, they're pretty proud of the power they believe that they wield. They are part of the state legislature, and they believe that they can craft legislation and they can control the direction that Virginia goes in. And you can remind them that based on the Supreme Court, they can't. Based on a Supreme Court decision or a series of Supreme Court decisions, you can't regulate any out-of-state money, even if you wanted to. You can't control your own elections. A lot of Republicans talk about election security, election integrity, and whether it's just their own next race, they have no control over the integrity of their own state's election process. And it may behoove them to get in the game and recapture that ability that they once had prior to FEC versus Citizens United. I argue that the American Promise Amendment, or whatever we're going to call it, the 20th Amendment, doesn't actually regulate anything, and it doesn't take anything away. All it does is restores the power of the state and federal legislatures to do what they once could do prior to this wash of money coming in. So I would engage them and say, you can also engage them and say, can you control how much money goes into a ballot initiative? And in Kansas, there's this value them both, which is, it's basically a pro-life piece of legislation. And I pointed out that you're going to get spending from outside, from both coasts. And as a state legislator, you can't do anything about it. You can't say a single thing about that spending because the Supreme Court will strike it down saying, well, that's free speech, it's protected.
Oops.
John?
Yeah, so Nancy, one approach in their districts, obviously, what Alan said, I support in terms of how to implement that possibly via the business network in the districts that these folks come from. If we can have outreach and find 1 or 2 business owners that are either a member of the local chamber down there or the local Rotary Club down there, there's got to be someone who agrees with us. what we found out in Maine is that there is a visceral reaction, including some far-right Republicans, to all this outside money coming into our state. Who are they to tell us what to do? And if we can find, a couple folks in their districts that are a member of the Rotary or the Chamber, we have presentations in the Business Network Library. And if we can get a foothold, get a presentation going, and then, talk to these senators or delegates or legislators about these folks in their districts that they may not know about, who support American Proposition 28. That might be kind of a boots on the ground way to gain some traction.
Well, I'm going to throw it back to Michael. Michael, is there another question?
Yeah, I think Joan might have a question. Joan, do you want to ask?
No, I think she asked it before.
Just
She put
in the
another one in
chat.
there.
It's really just a matter of, I worked with Elizabeth and whoever it was on the presentation that for small business, and I'd like to just sort of set up time with one or both of you or whatever makes sense in terms of doing stuff in New Jersey.
Yeah, that would.
I think I mentioned that to you before, so I guess I should just contact you offline and set up a mutually convenient time.
That would be great. Yeah, just to reemphasize, the business network is embedded in the normal chapter, right? So we're not a separate group of people. So the folks that we attract who are business leaders in Virginia will be under your chapter, Nancy and Mike. So that's important to say. And I think Joan and Alan, I think it's important to point out that our last NCLC, I think we had over 100 meetings with legislators. Is that right? I mean, that's a tremendous number, right? So the business network is going to be embedded as part of that, right? So we'll hopefully have business leaders coming with you all, your chapter leaders, on those meetings. So we're going to complement the existing chapters. Now, in states where we don't have a chapter, like I believe, for example, in Wyoming right now, we don't have a chapter. If it's a business leader that steps up first and wants to be the chapter leader, then that will be the chapter, and the normal chapter will be embedded under that business leader. But we're all embedded in the same chapters statewide. I just wanted to make that clear.
If I may, I have a question for Alan in terms of our national strategy, because 21 states, Alaska passed resolutions to support overturning Citizens United, and Virginia we did get a resolution saying that they support citizen advocates who care about this issue. So it was sort of like expressing support. So what is the role of states like Virginia? We have 7 Democratic representatives, 2 state legislators who are Democrats, 4 Republicans. We're not going to make the difference in getting this resolution through. We want to be one of the first states to ratify. But in terms of your focus, this right to left thing, Virginia, how does Virginia fit into that?
Virginia is one of our priority states. It's where we want to put a lot of influence because of the volume of spending and because the circumstances on the ground lead us to believe that it's a good strategy to try and bring on some of the representation from Virginia. It's right there in DC. You see it all. We do believe that Virginia, some of the Republicans of Virginia, maybe not the ones that are there this cycle, maybe they're the ones that are there next cycle, but we want to keep a heavy presence in Virginia because it should be one of the early states to ratify, but your delegation needs to be on board for passing the amendment.
And I think in terms of business, I mentioned this, the person who signed from Alexandria. I mean, that's where we need John's assistance. We did a little video with Susan, but we don't know how to amplify our messages. And a lot of our legislators, the Republicans, that might be of interest to them to have these short messages from businesses and to bring attention to the issue. But in terms of amplifying our message, that's something that we really need help from AP National. And I'm sure it's the same in Joan in New Jersey or Ellen Greenbush in Ohio. It's all about amplifying these messages and influencing people.
Right, and leveraging the support that we have now. So you don't have a lot of AP chapters south of where you're at now. So my objective would be to grow some of the chapters to get some of those red districts to start a chapter and make the issue heard, make it announced. Have an event, get it on the news like they did in Maine, get a press release with a great story like that under the avalanche, and then get nightly news to talk about it because they can't hide from it. Up in Susan Collins, that her Senate race, we were able to insert into the debate a specific question about the constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. She had a poor answer, but had she lost that election, we would have absolutely said, you lost the election because you said you weren't in favor of overturning Citizens United. So we keep doing things like that, and we'll leverage each step forward to grow, to get 2 more steps forward. And I mean, so far the leveraging is working. We need to expand more into some of these red districts, and we need to capitalize on this last election cycle where Republicans took a shellacking. I mean, financially, they didn't lose many seats, but they could have.
Patricia, do you have a question that you wanted to ask? I know your hand's been up for a while.
Yeah, I have lots of questions. This is Patty Marcy. I am a recent member of American Promise, thanks to meeting Nancy. And I keep struggling with what the basic principles are for the larger strategic messaging about the nefarious influence of money across the country in every race in terms of funding disinformation. I mean, I'm a former state candidate twice, so and also have been in both parties and have worked in every level of campaign from local to presidential. And I guess I keep struggling with not hearing what I think is the most important thing, and that is, if I live in a district and other people from outside the district are pouring money in to campaigns in my area, mostly to proliferate misinformation, that's something that every single person should be extremely angry about, right? But I mean, if I had my ideal campaign finance bill, it would start with only human beings can give money to candidates, and they can only give to candidates that they can vote for at every single level. If you can vote for the person, you can contribute. So I don't know, I keep struggling with, like, how do we get people to understand how angry they should be about this? How much of a pollutant to our democracy that we say we're proud of, that our campaign finance system is. So I'll leave it at that for now and just see what you guys, if you guys have talked about those pieces.
I'll remind what John had said about Maine. Mainers were mad. I mean, they were furious. And this did become a huge media piece for a week and a half. And it got people on board, and the state was forced to pass a resolution that they had to do something. Why won't the members of Congress listen to their constituents? I mean, how we've been asking for infrastructure forever. We've been asking for immigration reform forever. We've been asking for all these things, healthcare, and they don't listen because of the money. And so our job is to get them to listen about the money. And it's just, like I said before, we have to leverage what we have, and we need to get a lot bigger. We have to bring a big spotlight down on this issue and remind people that everything comes after this, but we fix this first. and then convince enough, specifically convince enough Republicans in Congress that it's American democracy is worth fighting for.
But I almost feel like the real kind of cork in the bottle, if you will, is that anyone who's already in power is in power because they're playing the game pretty well, right? And we know that the power of incumbency is mostly that people believe that if you've won once, they need to put money down on you so that you will do their bidding. And in either side, right? That I got money from both people that gave to both sides when I ran, only because they thought I had a chance, and they had already given to my opponent. So they've got plenty of money to give to both sides. And is somebody chiming in? So I guess what I'm thinking is the way to really start putting the screws to people is, if you're in office and you're not supporting this, we will support your opponent, unless your opponent is, completely unacceptable. But we will support the candidate who understands that this is an absolutely essential change that has to happen to clean up our politics and start making good policy. So I don't know. I just feel like we need to be tougher on that.
I agree, and I'm a bit more extreme than you. I would argue that we will support your opponent regardless of whether he or she is qualified, regardless, because it's the single election. But if you're not with us to change the political system that is so horribly broken, I would vote for potato over you. And I mean, that's my strategy. But I don't think Jeff can prove that.
So Alan, I would argue, getting back to a conversation a little while ago, I would argue that if you can get rid of the influence of big money in the politics, you also eliminate the need for term limits, because the term limits are really there to control what amounts to this. So how do you deal with that? Sorry, that's a rhetorical question.
No, and I'm with you on that. Term limits would become moot if legislators, if members of Congress did their jobs and they earned their election wins. If they earned them, then it wouldn't matter how long they were there, because they earned them. But again, my strategy is I have to recruit Republican support, or we'll never get it across the aisle or across the finish line. I got to make good friends with Bob Dole, and Bob Dole, he advised this one specific thing. He said, first he said, you got to live in DC. And he said, you've got to make friends across the aisle, because if you don't, any legislation that you pass will exist only as long as your party's in power. Bob Dole said this. So we want this to be an amendment, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states. I'll do what it takes to get this across the finish line.
Yeah, if I can just add, Patricia, to what you asked. I know we're 5 minutes over, so I'll make this really quick. So just so you know, the kind of the infrastructure at American Promise, Alan and Jeff are basically the bosses of everyone at American Promise. They set the political direction nationally, okay? Then you've got the communications department, which is this guy by the name of Gregory Joseph, and then empowerment is downstream, which is what I'm a part of. I'm the furthest downstream. But what you just were saying, if you have ideas, and sometimes it is just like an image, like a cartoon of what Alan just said. I'd rather vote for potato than you. We have a communications department, Gregory, and if you have any ideas, he thinks about this stuff all day, every day. Like, how do we communicate quickly? And he's really good with graphics and all that. So if anybody has a cartoon or an idea of what you just said, Patricia, about where's the anger, how do we get this going? If anyone has an idea of an image or a cartoon, Gregory's there. He'd love to hear from you and collaborate. And I can set that up, or Alan can. So that's helpful.
Well, thanks.
Nancy,
Mike,
Nancy, real quickly, I'd like to really encourage both Alan and John along the lines that John just laid out. I've been in the situation where I was in a national office leading state offices, And one of the best things you can do as a national leader is exactly what John just did, is lay out an idea where you can support us as local chapters with a definitive action. So, hey, if you guys could come up with this, we could help you do that. And that is huge as a national leader.
Yeah, and thanks for that. And thanks for you guys. It's already 6:37. I just want to thank you guys. And I want to let you know, I mean, American Promise, the time frame for getting this constitutional amendment is July 4th, 2026. And our job in Virginia, apart from the campaign finance issues, which are more complex perhaps, is to make sure that Virginia becomes the first state to ratify this. And unlike the ERA, and just to correct you, American Promise always calls it the 28th Amendment. It will be the 29th because we will get to ERA. So that's our job. That's our job here in Virginia, is making sure that Virginia becomes the first state to ratify this. And we're really delighted that you joined us this evening. And we hope, Alan, that we can call on you when we organize. Trying to meet with Republicans, especially in our representatives in Congress, because the messaging is, I mentioned Whitman, he's on the Armed Services Committee, he's a veteran, he gets $1 million a year in defense contract, donations from the defense contract industry. So we need a voice as well as John. So hopefully working with both of you will take it to the next level.
Thank you so much for this. And please do call me. That's my entire purpose, is to serve you and to support all of your efforts, because it will be you that does it. It will be the chapters, state leaders. It will be the people behind American Promise that get the 29th Amendment passed and ratified.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy.
Bye.